Great. Robert, why don't you introduce yourself a little bit?
I'm Robert Biswas-Diener. I am a researcher, a coach trainer, and a passionate enthusiast for all things ethics. How about yourself, Carol?
Well, no, you forgot to mention you have a master's in ethics, like you actually know what you're talking about.
I did do my master's is in clinical psychology, but my thesis was specifically on ethical dilemmas in clinical approaches. Yeah, so I've been loving this stuff from the get-go. And if you ever hung out with my family, you would definitely have us say, well, what would be ethical in this particular situation? I mean, those are the kinds of conversations we like to have.
Well, my father was a CEO sociopath, so I came to ethics the other way. So when I was little, my father used to sit me down and say, this is how you lie. And he used to teach me how to lie, which is apparently a good way to make somebody interested in ethics. So guys, I'm Carol Kauffman, and I'm the founder of the Institute of Coaching with Margaret Moore and Susan David. I've been teaching at Harvard since I was, I think, 12, technically 27. And also, I'm very proud that I am a visiting professor at Henley, which I think you guys are fantastic. I'm also at Egon Zehnder as a senior leadership advisor, and most of my time is also spent coaching, which I love. So Robert, want to kick us off? When we started, no offense guys, but I'm like, ethics? Really? I'm gonna do a keynote in ethics. One, what do I know? Two, I always thought ethics were kind of on the boring side. You should know, kind of a hygiene issue. You should know them. I don't think that anymore.
Yeah, I think that's such a common way of thinking. And I think the group of people who are here at this conference probably are exceptions to that rule. You wouldn't have signed up for an ethics conference if you thought it was just such an awful thing to do. But I think that everyone should realize that that's not the common experience. If you go out and talk to coaches the world over, they think, ethics is a bit of a yawn fest. It's a bit boring. It's a bit restrictive. It's a bunch of rules. I've been in conversations and in trainings where people said, overwhelmingly, ethics are boring, and that is my take on ethics. They're a necessary evil is the approach. And it's just shocking to me because not only am I passionate about ethics, but I think ethics are a vital foundation upon which we build responsible practice. And ultimately, when I think of ethics, I don't think of a list of rules. I think of guiding principles, and they are principles to guide decisions in difficult to figure out circumstances. I think a lot of people, that rule-bound mentality comes about because you think oh, should I sleep with my clients or not? And that's kind of the easy one, no, you shouldn't. But, should I have lunch with my client? Should I take a referral fee? Should I be friends with my client? What if we are friendly? That to me starts feeling like what ethics are for. When things aren't clear to us, and we all face these, and we need some help along the way, some wise counsel. I think we can find that in the professional ethics codes. Yeah.
So Robert, I'm wondering if you could help frame this a little bit. So everyone here is interested in ethics, but you also have to be onboarding others to ethics. Do you want to kind of walk us through what are some of the kind of resistances and ways that you've helped people get past them?
Yeah, I would, because I've just started thinking about this and trying to codify it. So this won't be an exhaustive list, and I'm actually curious what you think about it, if you have anything to add. But so here, just kind of off the top of my head, are some things that I hear from people. Number one, I don't plan on doing anything wrong, so I don't have to pay too much attention to ethics. My dad once got his driver's license, and one of the questions on the test was, what are the penalties for drunk driving? He's like, why should I have to know that? Because I don't drink and drive. Who cares? Is it a year in jail, 10 years in jail? I don't know. Why would I need to know it? It doesn't apply to me. And I think that's a fallacy, but it's an obstacle. I think some people aren't members of professional associations and not part of the Association of Coaching or the IOC or the ICF, the MCC, any of those. And so they're like, so I'm kind of, as an unaffiliated person, I don't fall under the purview of ethics. I think a really dangerous one is people who say, I go with my intuition. I do what feels right. And I think that intuition is a great rule out, but not a great rule in for ethics. So if it doesn't feel right, I think it's probably not right and you shouldn't do it. Intuition is good on that side of the equation. But if it feels right, it still might be wrong, right? I do think there are people having sex with their clients because it feels right to them. So you can't trust just because it feels right, but I think you can trust it feels wrong. So that's another potential one. I don't agree with the ethics codes, or just codified ethics in general is another one. And then just that last one, which is this just feels like a list of rules, kind of like playing a board game. The thing we're passionate about is the game. And every once in a while, yeah, we've got to consult the rules just to see whose turn it is or whatever. But mostly that's not the thing we're interested in. So those are some of my initial thoughts about what's preventing people from interfacing with ethics. Back to you, Carol. Like, what do you think? Am I wrong? Am I right? I don't know.
You're always right, Robert. So one thing, I feel terrible that I can't remember the guy's name. He wrote the book called When Good People Have to Make Tough Choices, Bushnell or something. But I really love his idea of ethical fitness. I mean, isn't it a great term, just sort of ethical fitness, and how do you build those muscles? And part of the way you build them is by, at first, I think just sort of noticing sort of ethical issues. But he also described it, ethics is obedience to the unenforceable as opposed to legal. So I think, Robert, your definition, which is about me excited, it was guiding principles for really uncertain decisions. And this other one about obedience to the unenforceable. I like those because those are just more kind of how do you think about it? Because we think of ethics as constraining as opposed to helping. So that's that I think is what really flipped me to get very interested in ethics.
Yeah, I love the idea of ethical fitness as a phrase, and to think that you could be more or less fit. And even within an individual, that there's going to be variability. There will be times when you're more fit or stronger as a coach, and times when maybe you're cutting corners or you feel more harried or whatever. Is there more about that idea of ethical fitness?
Well, I think it is interesting in terms of, wondering what's your training been, what's your exposure been. But I like the idea of, this is something that you had mentioned. So what are ways to build ethical fitness, as us? And one of the things I think is really like cases. So at the ESMT, I see Andres Bernhardt is here. I think he started this, is something called tricky coaching cases, where you start out with half of the case, and then you do basically what I call the Dr. Seuss question is, what would you do if this happened to you? So I think it would be fascinating for people here to do something like that, where you start out with a case, get to the point of the ethical dilemma, and then have, work groups or different groups of people just thinking, what would you do and what are the issues? So that might be an interesting way to be building that. By the way, Lisa, thank you. How it's got the same. Rushworth Kidder is the guy who wrote How Good People Make Tough Choices. So
Book cases and leadership coaching. Perfect. We're getting a book recommendation right there.
yeah.
Fantastic. Yeah, I love that idea, Carol. Both you and I come to coaching from a clinical background. And for clinicians, case studies, case examples are par for the course. One of the things that I liked that the ICF started doing, but I don't think they do it nearly enough, is they started creating these annual reports of ethics. So they'll say, look, last year we had 38 ethical complaints brought to us. We investigated 21 of them. 12 of them were founded, and here was the resolution. But they do it in such a general way. They'll just say, it was an ethic having to do with professional behavior with a client. Well, that's a pretty broad sweep. And they'll say, and as a result, we assign them to mentor coaching. But really, I think if we were more concerned about training coaches in ethics, whether that's basic training or CCEs, we would create really detailed case studies for life coaching, executive coaching, career, just absolutely everything, where we detailed what happened, what went wrong. And sorry to be so kind of verbal about this, but I'm a climber, and every year there's a book called Accidents in North American Mountaineering, and it traces every single accident that happens in the mountain that led to an injury or death, and sort of who was involved, what their experience was, what led up to it, how it could have been avoided. And it's an amazing resource, and I want coaching to have that.
You know what? You just made me think. Wouldn't it be interesting to have like ethical success stories? Everything you've talked about is sort of ethical violations. And I can't think about what the opposite word for violation would be. But why not have sort of paragons of virtue? So Lillian, I see your hand up. Is that an accident, or do you want to ask us a question? Oops, you've disappeared.
No, it wasn't an accident. I was just coming at this same question from being very interested in ethics as a supervisor, as a coach supervisor.
Yes.
And if you had any comments, because people will take, it's one thing to notice, being willing to notice your own ethical conflicts if and when they come up, because for sure they do as a coach. And it's another thing to bring it to supervision. And I know for myself, that's usually where I bring it and talk it through, sometimes with colleagues as well. I was curious about, I guess, two things. One is how this discussion can also include supervision and what types of things are brought to supervision and what time. I'm curious about the different types. So that's area one. Number two is, what are some of the ethical dilemmas in coaching, Robert, that I think you mentioned you knew, categorized, have seen overall?
That's great, Lillian. We'll definitely get to specific ethical dilemmas later on. So we are going to drill down from the big talk to more fine points. But I think that supervision is part of this, because I think that ethics isn't just about practitioners interacting with their clients and trying to promote their clients' welfare and avoid harm. I think that's a portion of it, but it's also much larger. How do we train coaches? And that includes ongoing supervision or mentor coaching, the types of messages that we are trying to inculcate in our supervisees, but also any conflict we have with our supervisees, our own values. I mean, I think that is just part and parcel of the whole conversation. Because I do think that people narrowly think of ethics just as about resolving an ethical dilemma in the context of I have an interaction with a client. And that is maybe even the lion's share, but it's certainly not all of it. Carol, you got some thoughts about other aspects that's not just coach-client direct problems, I think.
Okay, but I'm just going to tell you what fell into my head now. It has nothing to do with what you just said or the question, really.
Fair enough,
but it's possibly relevant, which is I never realized it until this moment. So I think a lot of mini ethical dilemmas have to do with our ego and putting our ego into a session in some way. Like if I say X, I'll be smarter. Or the client will think better of me. And those are like mini ethical dilemmas in a way, because I know what I try to do is before every session, I'm not a great meditator, so we're talking 30 seconds here. I'll sort of pause and remind myself, I'm here to be of service. That's why I'm here. I'm here to be of service and to serve my client. And I think that helps me avoid a lot of micro ethical violations of when I'm putting like my own impression management before what the person needs. And I'm not sure how you guys inspired that thinking right now in me, but I'm really wondering about how we can sort of prime the ethical pump before every session or encounter.
I love that thought. So yeah, I'm fine to veer off course with you in this area. Do you know, when I first started doing public presentations, whatever it was, 20 some years ago, I did kind of this, like, how do I build my confidence as a presenter? And I would just silently look at the crowd, and in my heart, I would think, I own you, right? Like this really, like, I'm powerful, like I just own you guys. And it gave me all this, like, strength. But yeah, but exactly, like after I did that for like a year, because it was effective in the short term, but I was like, this actually creates such a unusual relationship with the audience. Like, I own you, like it's like slavery or something. It's just like the worst thing to be holding in my heart about the people I'm trying to serve. And so all I did is I dropped the N and I just said, I owe you. And that's what I do to this day. I take a beat before I present, and I think, kind of, how can I be of service? What do I owe these people? And it does change things, because I think it puts principles first, and principles ultimately are what is guiding us. So it's less about me and my performance and more about the principle of service.
So Robert, do you want to go on and continue some of what we thought about, or respond to a couple of questions?
Sure. So so to just expand out real quick, beyond that ethics are about me and the client, I also think that it's really important to realize that ethics are about protecting the coaching reputation, the profession as a whole, and that collectively we're in this together, and our behavior and decisions and communication matters for all of us. And you actually, Carol, just had a fantastic example of that today, I thought.
I just texted you to say I didn't want to do it, but okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Don't do it then. Don't say it.
It's too late now. It's too late now. So, okay, Wendy, Robert and I were aware that we didn't want to do the blue thing. We just didn't feel super comfortable. So it's interesting, because we thought, do we do it? Do we not do it? And Robert didn't want to do it particularly. And I thought, well, I don't want to do it either, but it would be in the service of this organization for us to do it. And also, in any situation, I'm not just Carol, I'm the founder of the Institute of Coaching. So I need to kind of represent that. And in some ways that flips back to Robert, to, how do we protect the brand and the ethics and the foundation of coaching and its reputation by the way we manage ethical challenges.
I'm glad you did that, Carol. I think it's interesting, because it does show that, like, such small, seemingly innocuous decisions, actually, maybe that is how we build that ethical fitness, right? We go to the gym and we kind of flex our muscles around little choices about, should I use the background? Should I do what the person's asking of me? Who am I representing here? What would serve the client in this moment? And all of those reps make us strong across the long term, I think. You also, I thought, had a really interesting just kind of thing that's not about the reputation of coaching, and it's not about you and your client, but it's about your colleagues' behavior, which is also, an area that ethics covers, right? Because we sometimes, I guess, see when our colleagues cut corners or things like that.
Yeah, I guess we're talking about in psychology, there's a very clear APA code of ethics, which is, if Robert was doing something that I felt was not ethical or not best practice, my code is I need to talk to Robert first. Now, it may be, like I think Lillian was mentioning, maybe I'll go to my supervisor that's also confidential and work it through, but that's sort of the first step, and how to kind of have clear guidelines of step 1 is this, step 2 is this, step 3 is that. So is that what you were referring to, Robert?
Yeah, exactly. Because I think that it almost in my heart feels easier to just make a decision about how I'm going to interact with a client than if I saw you doing something that I disagreed with, Carol, because you and I have an ongoing relationship, and like, wow, how exactly do I face that? And in fact, I think that raises the question that just how do we go about ethical decision making? Christian van Nieuwerburg, who a coach I really respect, came up with these 4 C's, and he said, well, yeah, you look at the code of ethics, that's 1. You look at the contract, that's 2. You look at your own core values, because those can come to the table, that's 3. But importantly, you also go to your colleagues, and you don't necessarily make these decisions in a vacuum, and you seek wise counsel. And, I don't know if that's an exhaustive list, but I think it covers a lot of territory, and I like it quite a bit as a decision-making process about things large and small.
Yeah, could you just repeat the 4 C's so it stays in our brains?
Yeah, code of ethics, right? The formal code of ethics, the contract, your core values, and colleagues.
Okay. So one thing that we'll do, and I think after this we'll open up to questions, because some people have been asking some very interesting questions that I've been raising. So particularly Henry and Philippe. When I was looking through Rushmore's book, they sort of talk about 4 ways to think about ethics. And as I describe these, if some of you have some examples or comments on this, you could put them in the chat and maybe speak up about them. Now, the first one, unhappily, I don't remember exactly what he said, but it just aligned with Star Trek, where it basically says the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. So one, as you're kind of making a choice about something, where is that a lens? So for example, you have enough resources to coach 2 top leaders, or those resources go to 20. So if you're in HR or whatever and making these decisions, how do you do that? How do you decide who gets coaching? The other one is the short term to the long term. How do you balance those out? And Robert has a particularly somewhat despicable example of that. Want to do your nosedive?
Yeah, exactly. So I once had a coaching client, and it's one of the first times that I had coached someone in a leadership position. And they said, look, I want control of this relatively smallish company, and I have a business partner, and I want to put the business into a nosedive to drive my partner out. And that is my overt strategy. I'm going to dive down until everyone panics, my partner jumps ship, and then I'll right the ship, I'll pull up, and then I'll have full-on control, which just in itself seems like a very short-term strategy without consideration of long-term consequences, right? And just the idea there that what do you do? And I think you probably had similar types of things, right?
Well, I think so. Here's an example. Like, direct ethical confrontations don't typically happen in coaching, but I have had some. So I'm shortening up the story massively, but I had one client where his 360 said that he loses control, gets in people's faces, screams at them, and destroys them. Now, context is, this is a very powerful person. I was part of a group where we were going to have a major gig, and this person, who was also very snooty, would only deign to see me because of my pedigree. And whether or not we got the gig was dependent on his response to the coaching. Tough frame. So he then, I then say, so meanwhile, he started wanting to talk about being dethroned as a child. And I'm like, we have so got to get to this. So I then just made a fake leap. I said, oh, so how do you think this relates to, and it didn't. how does this relate to what it says here that, you know, you lose control and get in people's faces? And he says, oh, that's not true at all. So like any normal person, I think he's going to say he doesn't shout. And he goes, no, I don't lose control. I pick who I'm going to destroy and I choreograph the witnesses to their destruction. So now the entire gig is dependent on what this person thinks of me, and there I am. And some of you may know David Peterson, who just had a stroke. He was the head of coaching at Google, and he and I had been talking, and he said a sentence to me that was my ethical ballast. He said, and by the way, at this moment, it appeared in my mind like on a ticker tape. It was just very odd. And it was, if you know what you want to do and you're reasonably sure it will get you fired, if you don't say it, you aren't doing your job. So, so this guy, after he said, you know, I choreographed the witnesses to their destruction, and he said he was very Machiavellian, I actually cracked up laughing and said, excuse me, Machiavellian is like when you push someone out of an organization, they thank you for your help. Now, what do people feel about you? Okay, then he said a few things, and then it got to, are people here afraid of you, yes or no? And then he wouldn't answer. I said, are they afraid of you, yes or no? And then he wouldn't answer. I said, yes or no? And he said, yes. And then I could get to, does this serve you? Does this truly serve you? Is this who you want to be? And there very rarely have I had to, you know, like mano a mano with someone where I even step out of a more traditional coaching frame. And but what did get him is he at core did want to be of service to his organization. And when he decided in a rather demented way that someone was bad for the organization, it gave him carte blanche to destroy them. But, you know, it's interesting. I don't know if other people have had something that you could write on the side of when you've actually had someone doing something unethical, and then what do you do or what do you not do? In my case, I've navigated it mostly through questions, other than my evil laugh on him saying he's Machiavellian. But I'd love to hear some thoughts on that in the chat. But Robert, you can share your thoughts first.
Yeah, no, I mean, I like that in terms of thinking sort of, you know, expanding to the long term, like, are people afraid of you? How's that serving you in the long term? That's the same thing I had with the nosedive client. You know, that might accomplish your short-term goal, but what's the long-term impact on morale going to be? What about the well-being of the other stakeholders, all the people who work for you, and so forth? And just kind of wrestling with what's the coach's moral obligation for the people not in the room. You know,
that's a good one.
Which is just kind of a tough question, right? We have an obligation to that person, but, you know, in some broader sense, what about the well-being of the others that could potentially be hurt by these decisions? You know, and I think that's a really sticky and difficult issue to answer and navigate.
So by the way, Nikki, you're very funny. She's like, Carol, did you get the gig? The answer is yes, and it was a 6-year multi-million-dollar gig. And the person that I confronted became my greatest fan and referred people to me for many years. So he was sort of looking for someone to have the I guess the courage to like just give him a reason to stop.
Yeah.
But there's a really good question that I have it written down over here. I think it's Henry. So Henry, I'd love, do you want to ask your question about how much you share your own views and values?
Yes, thank you, Carol. I think the problem, most of my work is a co-visor. I prefer the word co-visor to supervisor for hierarchical reasons. And,
love it.
And power and all nasty things like that. The problem I find when I'm sort of confronted with people talking about, you know, we need to influence climate change and we need to change, you know, change the world in various different ways, is what are we here for? And are we here for the client, or are we here for the benefit of society? And I agree, it's very difficult, because sometimes the client will be doing things that are difficult for us. Like, if I was trying to coach somebody in ExxonMobil, I would have difficulties, both the fact that they want to go on digging up great amount of oil, and the second, that they're making a very big profit out of doing it. And so their investors don't want to let go. Now, do I say, okay, well, because I don't agree with what you're doing, I should withdraw as your coach? Or do I hang in there and sort of say, well, can we find better ways of fulfilling your objectives of making money without actually destroying the environment? And it's excruciatingly difficult.
What's interesting, so I was asked once to coach the then CEO of Philip Morris, and it was, I don't know, it was again my first gig. It was like when I first started at a very significant gig, and they said, "Will you coach the CEO of Philip Morris?" And I just felt all the energy drain out of my body. So my being was saying no. I mean, I didn't get to ethics. And so for that case, I said, listen, I think for the very first referral that you ever give me, I probably should take a position where I'll do a better job. I don't know that I would be of service. Now, of course, the joke is on me, because somebody else did jump at the chance, and it turned out the guy actually wanted to quit. But who knew that? But for another person, that would be okay.
I think the other example I have is a client of a coach that I was working with, who was so committed to their work that they were getting unfit. They weren't getting exercise. I can't go out because I'm too busy. I'm eating a bit more than I should. I'm drinking a bit more than I should. And I have a medical background, and I'm aware of all the harm that was doing him. Particularly, I'm all right at the moment, yes, but what about 5 years' time, the short and long term issue? And I wondered how far. I asked him to talk about it, and he recognized what he was doing. But I've got this brilliant book called Supercharge Your Brain, which has all this fantastic advice about how to look after ourselves. Now, should I send it to him, or should I just say, no, we've had our discussion, I'm going to let it go?
Yeah, it's a great question, Henry, and I think we all deal with these kinds of issues. If you were in basic coach training, you'd say, oh, well, that's your agenda and you shouldn't do it, but we're all much more advanced than that, right? And so is the body business relevant? Absolutely. If the client has come to you because they want to be a better performer at work, raising questions about their health, their sleep should be on, in bounds, and not just, the coach's private agenda. But it's a continuum. What about climate change? Is that somehow in bounds? And that might feel a little bit further down the continuum, right? So ultimately, it's not black and white, and we have to make those kinds of decisions. Like Carol, I've turned down working with big tobacco at the outset, because I just know I have a guiding principle, and I don't think I could do a fair job in that industry. But I will say yes to big oil, in part because I'm a consumer of oil. So I just feel like I'm already part of that world. But that's my own individual choice, and it might be different than yours or Carol's.
Yeah, so fair enough. I mean, what you're saying is we have to make our own decisions, having talked about it and found our way to what's right for us.
Right.
Yeah.
So there's another great question, and Robert, this is up your alley, and it's from Philippe Rosinski. Do you want to surface and talk about the question you had, if you remember it?
Yes, yes, I think so. Yes, thank you for your great presentation. Yes, I was. The question is, the focus seems to be around coaching dilemmas, and it seems to me that there are other perspectives when you look at ethics, other philosophical currents in ethics that don't consider just dilemmas. And so I wonder what is the place of those different philosophical currents in your thinking and in your approach? I'm referring to consequentialism, virtue ethics, for example, ethics of giving. To what extent does that have a place in your approach? And the second part of the question was about ethics being formed by different cultural traditions. So, I mean, a lot, two big questions. I don't know how much time you have to.
Yeah, I mean, these are things you could write whole books about, of course, but I think they're fantastic questions. Ultimately, even ethics comes out of the philosophical tradition of ethics, right? It's a branch of philosophy. Long before it became a professional codification, and even in the professions, they say it's rooted in moral behavior. These ideas of right and wrong, that is virtue ethics. It's rooted by cultural and societal values like justice or social justice, which means different things for different groups. So I do think those things are all worth considering because they do influence us. And that's why I don't myopically just look at what does the ethics code say. It's got to be broader than that. I think that's a great place to start, but not a great place to end in making those kinds of considerations. And I had something, what was your second question? Because I also like
about the fact that different cultural traditions can also inform our concept of ethics. And yeah. I mean, where I'm coming from is I have the sense today that, you know, there is sometimes talk about ethics and people have not necessarily taken the time, of course, I'm not talking about you, but to study ethics, different philosophical tradition in ethics. And it becomes a matter of, I'm looking at a situation, what is the right choice, wrong choice? And yes, I do reflect a little bit on it, but it could be so much more. And that's the part I just want to hear you about.
Yeah, so I think my instinct is that the aspect of this that coaches have the most kind of intuitive grasp of is pragmatism. Because I'll just give you a couple of cultural things that I think we do in coaching culture. Number one, we spend a lot of time dealing with so-called saboteurs, obstacles. What are you afraid of? What's holding you back? And that's a very problem-focused orientation. And one of my biggest changes in coaching was dropping all of that. I almost never ask a question like that, not because I'm some just solutions-focused fanatic, but because I'm like, it kind of feels bad to the client. I don't know if it treats the client's time as effectively and respectfully as it otherwise could. And so I just started asking, are we as coaches pretending like our clients are broken? And every coach here is going to say, no, of course not. We think the world of our client. And yet you say, oh, you've got faulty thinking that needs to be fixed. And that really comes to us from psychotherapy. And it's really prevalent in coaching. And so I'm like, these are just, coaching has adopted a culture that is in part influenced by therapy. And I don't know if it's right or wrong. I'm not a policeman for it, but it's something I'm just thinking about and wrestling with. And another quick example is you often hear coaches say, I don't believe in shoulds, as if, oh, you just feel obliged to this. And I think, you know what, most of the world's cultures believe heavily in shoulds and social obligation and loyalty and doing your duty, like the world over. Like it's such an individualistic notion that you shouldn't believe in a should. So just these little ideas that kind of creep into are things that we might not even be aware of. And I'm trying, and I know I'm blind to 100 of these. Those are just two I can name off the top of my head. So these are the types of things I'm wrestling with all the time.
All right, thank you.
Thanks. Good questions.
So Robert, there's a couple of ways we could go now. We could go back to some of the lenses. We did needs of the many, needs of the few, short-term versus long-term. We also have justice versus mercy and truth versus loyalty. So we could go that way, or we could go to some of the kind of thorny little things like, you know, you've got to write a recommendation for someone and you actually don't think they're that skilled, but you care about them. So which way do you want to go?
Question. I don't know. I almost feel like putting it out like for a vote or something, but I don't know how we would do that.
Oh, okay. Hands. You know, you can do the little hands thing.
Yeah. So like getting into specific kind of dilemmas or ethical issues. Like, are there votes for that?
People know how to vote.
One vote.
Reactions. Why don't you do your little, you hear your reactions like that. So if
We're getting some enthusiasm for that. Let's do it. And yeah, it probably preferences the people who know how to work Zoom better, but
okay, but I don't know
they're
what
the
that,
future anyway. But let's get into
but I don't know what that is.
let's get into some of those pesky ethical themes that crop up, like the one you just mentioned, recommendations, and the one you mentioned before about coaching to competing people, those types of things.
So when people used to ask me, could you coach two people competing for the same job? I always said no. That was from it seemed to me, how much would that compromise who could trust you, etc. Now, what's interesting is now that I'm part of a management consulting organization, they actually have an offering they do, which is, in this case, me and a consultant, we do, in fact, together coach, in this case, the 3 CEO successors. And one of the things I have said has to happen is that we're not allowed to talk to anybody about our preference, nor can we leak our preference in any way. So just putting a lot of safeguards in there. And also each of them must know we're doing that. And then what I've also said to them is, listen, we're coaching everyone. Our goal is for you to be the best leader that you can be, and to be as committed as you can to the company regardless. And also, you're not I don't quite say you're not idiots. I said so, but also do not feel completely compelled to be totally authentic. Please be as authentic as you feel comfortable being with us, because it is an uncomfortable situation. And so far they've jumped in, but it was really tricky. And I love this question. How do I check myself internally that I'm not forming or betraying a preference? I think that's going to be hard. I think what's really important is I don't leak it to anybody. And also, and also my co-coach and I doing it, because at one point she was sort of, and I was sort of leaning, I said, hey, listen, just because we want to have dinner with this guy more than the others doesn't mean he's going to be the better CEO. So let's remember, this isn't about likability. But yes, we have, it does feel like the ethics for me, I feel like I can do it if I am really true to that. And I really do not leak, and then really have a pact with the other person that we are really good at that. And the challenge we have had is the CHR has already started to say, what do you think? And then I'll have to say, listen, I need to remind you, this is a tire shredder relationship. I can get information from you, but it's like when you go into a bank the wrong way, it shreds the tires. We're just not allowed to tell you anything. And we'll see, but it's hard, but it is ethically tricky.
It raises two really interesting issues, kind of reinforcing some earlier points. And that one is, this isn't in your professional code of ethics. You can't just go and look up, how do we navigate this? It's a really unique situation. And that's why you have to have that ethical fitness, is to say, okay, we're going to put our own rules around this, because the ethics code isn't going to cover all this. And kind of to, I think it was maybe Lillian's point, we all are going to have a relationship with our clients. We're going to like things they do, and that's a judgment. We're going to dislike things they do, and that's a judgment. And we just have to navigate that, right? Like there is no neutrality. There's the aspirational neutrality, perhaps, but I don't even know if we're trying to aspire to neutrality, because you kind of have to think the world of your client and really want the best for your client to work with them effectively, I think. And it's sticky.
Yeah, and Ruth has an interesting question of how do you get the balance between not leaking and being authentically yourself in this space? That's really great. The leaking is really, sort of like, you can be full of an emotion and it isn't in the service of your client to leak it. Like if you're going through a horrible divorce, you don't, if someone says, how are you? Like, oh my God, right? It's how do you contain it? And how do you stay true to the goal, which is, first of all, what do I know about who actually should be a CEO? I'm a coach, for God's sakes. So it's like, how do I just help each person be the best that they can be? And Lise mentions about a supervisor, and actually we do have someone that we check in with once a month.
And in general, supervision has been a point made in the comments a lot. And yes, I mean, supervision is great. Peer consultation, or peer supervision as it's sometimes called, is sort of a subsidiary form of that as well. But I think it all speaks to the larger issue that you don't do this in isolation. You're not just shooting from the hip, doing what you think is right, but you're putting heads together with wise counsel. Absolutely.
So, Robert, you had mentioned one about when you what you do when you feel like you're beyond your remit. When you feel you're either over your head or that the client has mental health issues. Kind of what did you want to speak to that? Or guys, do you have some comments on that?
Yeah. Before I do, I just want to, Lise, yeah, absolutely. I definitely agree. When I talk about peers or colleagues, those are large umbrellas, and I understand that supervision is a specific skill set within that. Yeah, I think that David Peterson, who you referenced earlier, he said, when the thing that sets the mastery coaches apart is the idea that they can handle complicated situations. But any of us could get into water that feels too deep or too turbulent suddenly for us, or something in our own life happens that sort of sweeps our legs out from under us. And I think that can happen in the short term or long term. Recently, I've been talking about people being sort of triggered in a session by something a client says, a casually racist comment or something like that, and feeling like, oh, wait, am I in too deep just in the moment and controlling my emotion? Or am I in too deep that this feels outside of my scope of practice? That the case feels too complicated for me. And I think that, as Lise says, this is a great point in favor of supervision. It's also a great point in favor of kind of slow thinking and not making the quick decisions, right? And ultimately, I think supervision is sort of slow thinking made manifest, which is whether I'm triggered right now or not, I don't need to make a decision about it right now. I can reflect after the session, between sessions, and that gives me the opportunity to use all my resources to navigate what to do. And I think sometimes you bow out of the coaching. There was a time a few years ago that I felt pretty burnt out coaching, and I just pressed pause on my own coaching. And I would like to hear from more coaches who say that. Like I kind of hear a lot of like, coaching is so fun and it's playful and we're doing such a good job. And I get that that's part of coaching culture. But I also think it's nice to hear coaches say, like, I wasn't at my best. And as soon as I saw that I was kind of cutting corners, or, I missed an appointment here or there, which is what happened to me. And I was like, what's going on? I got to stop coaching for a little bit and get it together, because my clients deserve that.
Really sort of, again, putting the client ahead of yourself. So yeah, look at that. There's a number of people who said, Rosie says she's had to pause. Laura, I've done the same, burnt out and stopped. Tia, definitely during COVID, I wasn't at my best. Wendy, I paused in late 1920. I think that's ethical fitness. That's ethical fitness, because, I'm sure you could have all used the money. And instead, it's like, I really need to honor myself and my capacity to serve my client. So
This should be, and I love, it feels so great to see all these people saying this. When, Carol, you write this book about what goes right when people made good ethical choices, that should be a chapter in it.
actually, somebody else needs to write that book.
Yes.
I am over my head in my current book.
Yeah. We have 5 minutes left. Shall we kick it out to people to see what they would like most?
Yes, nobody. Watch out if I cold call someone.
Can you
So-
elaborate on oh, Rosie's thing? Sorry, elaborate on an ethical dilemma related to mental health. I can take it. You can take it.
I'll take one piece of it. And Rosie, I should warn you that I'm going to close the session with a quote of something you said earlier. So just warning you. Yeah, what's very interesting is, you know, occasionally I'll be working with someone who has a trauma history. Now, I was a trauma specialist for 20 years. I know what to do. I know how to do trauma therapy. Hello, I trained generations of psychologists how to do that, but this is my coaching client. And what I do is I think of it's a labyrinth of choices. I wrote something once called Therapy is Following the Trail of Tears. Coaching is following the trail of dreams. And it's sort of like two similar houses, the coaching house, the therapy house. And they've got a lot of rooms that look the same, but you can never forget which house you are in. So when I do that, at times I have referred people, I haven't said I'm going to stop coaching. I'm like, how can we bring in someone and work with that? And the other thing, especially when I'm training new coaches and they go like, what do I do? And somebody brings up trauma. And the question I ask at that point is to ask the leader, how has going through this made you a better leader? And really kind of focus on that piece. Robert?
Well, of note, that's not treating. It's nodding to the presence of trauma, but it's not attempting to treat trauma, which I think is an important distinction. I've had 3 occasions that jump to mind where people suddenly manifested sort of mid-coaching some kind of clinical symptoms. One was someone that just went through a divorce, suddenly out of the blue, became depressed. We talked about what's the effect going to be on the coaching. We just pressed pause and it was simple enough, right? Like you probably aren't in a great space to get the most out of coaching. Let's just check in 6 weeks from now and resume if that makes sense. In 2 other cases, it was something that felt more urgent to the client, which was as they started to make change, and this was a young executive, they started having panic attack, clinically significant panic attacks. And we did continue coaching together, but I got a release of information to consult with the treating psychiatrist. One-way consultation. I didn't feel like the psychiatrist needed to tell me a damn thing, but I wanted to tell the psychiatrist what we were working on so that they could treat the thing that was more urgent in terms of distress. And you know, I knew what medication the person was taking and that they were showing up to therapy, but I didn't need to know any more specifics than that. So I think that having a basic understanding of kind of recognizing that scope of practice and the boundary of the territory is pretty important for people. So I don't know if that's helpful.
So I see that we are at the end of time, and Rosie Evans, I would possibly like to embarrass you, but I thought this was very, very lovely because again, ethics is serving something bigger than we are. And what she wrote is, when I notice my ego getting in the way of the mindful presence and coaching mindset, I like to breathe kindness out to my client and into myself. It helps bring me into a better mental space to approach and respond to the dilemma. So I wish for all of you, you know, to be able to do that as you're approaching this work. breathe kindness to yourself, to the client, and keep working on transcending your ego. Robert, would you like to have the very last word?
Nothing further to add. I thank everyone here for your time and attention. And of course, thanks to you, Carol. It's always a pleasure interacting with you and hearing from you.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Have a very, very, very good rest of the day. It's evening for a lot of you and the conference. And Wendy, thank you. This has been, guys, I don't know if you have any idea how Herculean Wendy is on everything she has been doing. So